26th, and we are here with our colleagues from Boston Public School System regarding dockets 0559 through 0563, orders for the FY19 operating budgets, including annual appropriation for departmental operations, annual appropriations for the school department, and appropriation for other post-employment benefits, appropriation for certain transportation and public realm improvements, and appropriation for certain park improvements, as well as dockets 0564 through 0565, capital budget appropriations, including loan orders and lease and purchase agreements. I'd like to remind folks this is a public hearing. It is being broadcast and recorded for later viewing on RCN Channel 82, Comcast Channel 8, Verizon 1964, and streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV. I'd ask folks in the chamber to silence their electronic devices. We will take public testimony at the conclusion of the department's presentation and questions from my colleagues. There is a sign-in sheet to my left. We ask that you state your name, affiliation, and residence, and please check the box if you do wish to testify. I'd like to also remind folks that there will be less than 36 hearings now, but throughout the budget hearings, there's 36 hearings over roughly six plus weeks. We strongly encourage residents, whether here in the chamber or at home, to take a moment to engage in this important process by giving testimony for the record. That can be done in several ways. First, coming to the hearing and signing up in the chamber. We have dedicated one public hearing on June 5th from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. To take only public testimony at that time. You can send your testimony to the Committee on Ways and Means, Boston City Hall, 1 City Hall Plaza, Boston 02201, as well as email at ccc.wm@boston.gov. In order of their arrival, my colleagues to my left, Councilor at Large Anissa Sabi-George. To my far left, Councilor Ed Flynn and Councilor Josh Zakem. Want to welcome Ellen and your team, Nate, Dave. Thanks again. Seen a lot of each other over the next several weeks, and I'll hand it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Councilor, and good morning.
Good morning.
The topic for our discussion today are school budgets. I'm going to start with a very brief overview of the FY19 BPS budget for members of our audience or folks listening at home who might not have been here on Tuesday when we kicked off this process. The proposed budget for next year is $1.109 billion, which represents a $48 million increase versus the budget you voted on last year at this time. The proposed budget for next year is rooted in the guiding principles that were developed by our Budget Equity Work Group. One of those principles is to put more money in the hands of our schools serving our highest needs students. So you'll see the hallmark of our FY19 proposal is a $40 million investment in our schools, $30 million of which goes to pay for rising salaries, and $10 million of additional dollars in the hands of our schools, really focused at our schools serving our highest needs students. That's going to be the subject of our conversation today. An overview of our total budget is found on the next page. I'll remind you that we think of our budget broadly in 3 categories: direct school expenses, which you'll see represented in our more detailed tables as the direct budgets of schools, as well as the benefits for the staff who work at, who are reflected in those budgets. The next biggest category is what we call school services budgeted centrally. Those include things like transportation, special education facilities. I'll note that we have a series of hearings coming up that will dive into a lot of those items specifically. Our focus for today is on that first category, the direct school expenses, how we think about allocating those dollars fairly and what they're going to be spent on. We're really excited about the investments that are part of this proposal. They're summarized here on page 5, and we talked about them in some detail last Tuesday. I'll remind you they include $6 million of system-wide investments. Some of the highlights that we're particularly excited about include $2.4 million for social emotional learning and wellness in the form of additional nurses, psychologists, and social workers, more money for translations and interpretations, and exciting new programs like Excellence for All and Becoming a Man. And then, of course, the $10 million that I mentioned earlier that's going to school budgets. With that brief overview of the budget, I'll now dive into how we think about funding schools equitably and transparently. Last year, when we were working on the FY18 budget proposal, we heard a lot about this topic. The voice of the community was strong. We heard people say, we want to do more and we want to do better for our schools. Based on the feedback we got, we have 4 priorities outlined here on page 7 about how we're funding schools in FY19. First is equity. To us, that means providing more resources to kids who need more. Second is transparency. That means our community understands where the money is going and why. Third is stability. We want to minimize the annual changes so that schools can plan year over year. And fourth and finally is school flexibility. We recognize that our leaders, parents, and teachers who are closest to kids often know what their specific communities want. So where appropriate, we want to empower them and hold them accountable to make the right decisions about what services their kids need. You'll see that we've made changes in FY19, our proposal for next year, along each of these 4 priorities. In the category of equity, we've taken almost $6 million of partnership funds that used to be allocated based on legacy relationships between the central office and schools and partners, and we're now allocating that with a formula, so it goes to our highest need students. We have $3 million in purely discretionary funds that are going to our highest need students as well. And we have $2.4 million of additional Well supports, those that I mentioned earlier, that again will be focused on our communities that need them the most. Transparency. If you go on our website, you will see lots and lots of information. We are very proud that we post almost everything that we do. You can track every dollar going to every school. And this year we're trying to do even more. We put an additional $5 million into WSF that had previously been outside of WSF to include things like our inclusion supports and our funds for students experiencing homelessness. Excuse me. In the area of stability, there are a number of important steps that we've taken. The first is that for schools that are experiencing small shifts, we want to protect them or soften those small annual changes that are a natural product of having a choice system like we have in Boston. That's why this year, for the first time, we introduced a new mechanism that we plan to keep in place in future years that completely protects schools from the first 1% of a decline in their budget. The second is that we instituted a $1 million soft landing pot of money specifically for schools that had big declines in the number of students in resource room, who needed resource room services. The reason for that is that we had a change in the trends of our enrollment projections this year. And again, we don't want schools to bear the brunt of a change in what we're doing on our projections. And lastly, we doubled down on a strategy that we put in place last year to have a reserve that's specifically targeted at our lower performing schools with declining enrollment. And we'll talk more about that in the hearing today, but we allocate that in partnership with our instructional superintendents, who are the supervisors of those schools. Lastly, I think you will see reflected in this a real effort to acknowledge schools are a unit of change. You want your kid to go to a great school. People choose schools, not school districts. We want to empower our school leaders to build that school that every parent wants to send their child to. We are empowering our school leaders to allocate more and more dollars. The examples include those partnership funds, which used to be allocated by the central office, and the resources to support students experiencing homelessness. With that, I'm going to turn it over to David Bloom, our budget director, who's going to walk us through some more of the details.
Good morning, everyone. On the next slide, we'll see a summary of school-based decisions that are made throughout our budget process. I just want to take a moment before I walk through those details to publicly recognize the budget team from BPS who guides 125 schools through the process of making these school-based decisions and provides support. They're all sitting up here on my left in order that I see them. There's Luna Agoro, Yvonne McCrae, Ben Ivey, Chris Williams, Cynthia Beltray, Afia Bompong, and Ali Slate. They've worked tirelessly over the last 6 months to make sure that our schools really are making the best use of their funds that they have. What that work has resulted in is a number of really positive benefits for the students of Boston. We're seeing an increase in teaching staff across the district of about, we expect to grow to about 80 staff when all of our reserves are liquidated. Increase in special education spending, an increase in supports for our English language learners, additional funding for those wraparound support positions that fill in the gaps between traditional instruction and the needs of students, such as guidance counselors, inclusion specialists, and instructional coaches. And finally, increases in the basics, things like instructional supplies. We're seeing schools have the flexibility and are taking that flexibility to budget more for those sorts of needed supplies. And we're proud that over the last 4 years, BPS has added 350 FTE to schools, mostly to support our highest need students, such as English language learners and students with disabilities. This table outlines how funding gets out to schools. You can see at the bottom that at $754 million, our direct school spending represents a significant majority of the spending of our district. The main method this funding goes out, about 2/3 of the funding is going out through weighted student funding. That is our funding formula for schools based on the needs of their students. There are then a handful of schools that don't go through weighted student funding. These are schools like the Carter School that provide support for a very specific and high need population of students, where we are setting up a budget for them as a program. That's what we have referred to as special programs. There's funds that come from the federal government through the state in the form of Title I and IDEA for students with disabilities that we pass through to schools. There are standard supplemental allocations that we give to schools, such as nurses and special ed coordinators. There are the soft landings that Eleanor was mentioning earlier. We have something called the sustainability allocation, that we have a minimum standard that all schools need to meet the needs of their students. If they're not able to meet that with the funding they get through their weighted student funding, we provide supplemental support in the form of sustainability allocations. Our autonomous schools have the ability to opt out of some central services and receive funding instead. There's a number of small additional adjustments that are called out in the footnote for specific programs and types of schools. These are things like extending the day at our early learning centers and early education centers, and some program-based supports for students with limited or interrupted formal education, students with emotional impairments. This amount, you'll notice, is decreasing, but it's decreasing because we have moved some of this funding out of this additional adjustments category and into weighted student funding itself. The last category of things I haven't mentioned already is our funding for expanded learning time. The majority of this money is for schools that are in the new Schedule A agreement between BPS and the Boston Teachers Union that we're currently in the final year of implementation. There are 58 now, in that agreement. There are also some pilot and autonomous schools that extend their day that are represented here. A quick summary of weighted student funding, and this is definitely simplified, but broadly speaking, what weighted student funding does is it creates a formula that assigns a dollar per pupil amount based on student need and multiplies it by the number of students with that type of need to get the total school budget. So over the next 3 slides. The dollars per pupil by need are determined by things like staffing, guidance, and class size ratios, state regulation, poverty, right? So, for example, a student who is learning English will get slightly higher funding than a student who is already proficient in English. You can skip it. Next one. Did we lose it? Okay, well.
Our screen seems to be frozen. David, why don't you just continue?
Okay,
while we
great.
resolve that?
To give a little more specificity to the types of weights on the next slide, we give some examples of the weights from the system. These weights include things like program type, so English language learners, students in special education, students in vocational education, their characteristics of student need based on things like the federal definition of poverty, the opportunity index, which is our new measure of student need, and then also measures of academic performance, what we call high risk, which is based on indicators of students who are struggling in going into 9th and 10th grade. Additional high schools get additional funding for those students. In addition to these student-based characteristics, every school receives a foundation budget to support the things that all school needs: a principal, a school secretary, a little bit of subs and supplies. As Eleanor mentioned, we're proud of the transparency we bring to the BPS budget. When you're looking to determine a budget by school, there are 4 main documents on our website that you can use to determine that. The top 2 documents are available as a 1-pager per school, so there's 116 of these, one for each school in weighted student funding on the left, and then on the right, 125 allocation 1-pagers. This would allow you to determine exactly how every dollar gets calculated for each school. The tables on the bottom show you a summary of those statistics for all schools across the district. Weighted student funding is the primary method we use to allocate funding out to schools. As such, supporting schools with changing enrollment is a key part of our budget process. Overall, enrollment in BPS has been relatively consistent for the past 5 years, somewhere between 56,460 and 56,893. This October, our enrollment was down slightly from the prior October, but we are anticipating our trend of steady enrollment to continue. We see that Commonwealth charters are continuing to add seats, approximately another 525 next year, primarily in the upper grades at this point. We're proud of the fact that we've continued to add seats and capacity to serve students in K-1. We're projecting to serve 726 students in K-1 more than what we had served in the 13-14 school year. In middle school, we're seeing some declining enrollment. Our traditional middle schools, those with grades 6 through 8 only, have gone from seeing about just under 3,000 students in the school year 2012-13 to just under 1,900 students in the current year. This is primarily due to the expansion of the K-8 model, which has meant that students are staying in their elementary school versus going to a traditional middle school. High schools are also feeling some financial pressure because of what we are seeing as a decrease in high school enrollment from last year's 9th grade class, which is now this year's 10th grade class, which means that high schools are just seeing smaller cohorts. As we look by neighborhood, we're seeing differing demand in different neighborhoods of the city, where some neighborhoods, such as Hyde Park, Mattapan, parts of Dorchester, are growing and we're struggling to find enough seats to fit the demand. In other neighborhoods, such as South Boston or Allston-Brighton, we're seeing declining enrollment in BPS. For next school year, we are projecting to see an increase in the number of students in schools that were level 1 or level 2 under the most recent state accountability system, which was done last year. Around 50% of BPS students are projected to be in schools that were level 1 or level 2, according to the last state accountability system. As we look at enrollment and budget together, we're seeing that 92% of our students are attending schools with an increasing budget. That's across 111 schools with a median increase of $220,000. 13 schools representing 8% of our students are seeing a decreasing budget with a median decrease of approximately $90,000. That's not the full picture of weighted student funding. However, the weighted student funding base weight, the base amount we give per pupil, is adjusted in line with rising salaries. So some schools with declining enrollment can still be affected by rising salaries. There are 49 schools that had increasing overall budget but declining enrollment, and we wanted to review those schools and make sure they weren't struggling. 20 schools, at 20 of the 49 schools, new investments offset enrollment declines, leading to increased staffing despite enrollment decline. At 11 schools, despite enrollment decline, they were able to keep their staffing level mostly flat. And there were about 18 schools, in addition to the schools mentioned on the previous slide, where the budget was increasing, but there are decreasing staffing levels, though those staffing levels are relatively minor. We're partnering with schools that are in that situation to identify immediate and long-term solutions. Part of what we do is look at under-enrolled classes or programs. What is it about the school that's causing an under-enrollment in class, and is there anything we can do to help update that program? Some of it is just solutions we can do in the school, changing the structure of how they organize to support their students. Other things we need to work across schools, and those types of program shifts take longer because it might result in a student pathway changing.
That concludes our presentation. We'd be delighted to take your questions.
Thank you very much. I know that you mentioned the static enrollments for the past several years, but I think that pretty much goes back 10 years. My recollection is I don't think we've exceeded 56,000 or say 57,000 students for the past 10 years. Meanwhile, our population has grown hundreds of thousands, so I guess it's safe to say that we're losing a lot of families.
Well, I think there's a couple things that have happened over that 10 years as well. The charter school expansion has certainly taken some of the students that would have been enrolled in BPS, and instead they're enrolled in the charter schools, which have expanded over the last 10 years. I think the other thing is we do see some differences in just the size of cohorts by year. And so right now we have a smaller cohort of students. Actually, it's a larger cohort of students exiting high school. They're being replaced by a cohort of students that is more typical. So what it looks like is declining high school enrollment. And some people think it's because people are leaving, but it's really just about the cohort of students that started with us was smaller. And so you see from K2, first grade, different sizes than fourth and fifth grade, which has a larger cohorts moving through. So it's hard to assign causality or whether or not families are leaving Boston at a greater rate, or to just compare that to our overall enrollment.
So what have the charter school numbers been over that same period, say, the past 10 years. Are we up around 15,000 charter students now? Is that about right?
I believe they've just about reached the cap, which is at 17% of net school spending. So it's at, the state law actually does it as a percent of spending, but it roughly translates to students as well.
Okay.
And I could pull those numbers. I don't have them open in front of me in terms of charter enrollment
Yeah,
growth
but
over the last 10 years, but we can follow up with that.
And obviously, the mayor, and I applaud him for his efforts in increasing K-1 seats, and I think it is like over 3,000 seats now. Is that right?
There's almost 3,000 seats in the system, about 2,900 total K-1 seats, or K-1 students enrolled.
So that's up from what before, up to when he came in, I guess.
We've added roughly 725 seats.
725 seats over the past 4 years, which also indicates we're losing other kids too. And then, another troubling development that came up during yesterday's hearing is of all the students that we graduate, 50% don't finish college, which I think is very, very troubling. But, we're going to get to vocational ed in the next segment, and hopefully we can focus greater attention and resources there to make sure that there's a pathway to jobs, at least, for these kids. Let me recognize that we're being joined by Councilor Tim McCarthy, and let me recognize Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again for being here. I'll say that. We'll put that on a recording. Thank you, thank you. As I mentioned the other day over the BPS, during the BPS overview budget hearing, that we had invited, Council Siomo and I had invited the BSAC students to participate. And because today was during the school day, they did submit written testimony, so I'd like to just read it into the record, and I shared a copy with all of you and my colleagues. So this is the submission. My name is Evelyn Reyes, and I am a sophomore at the John D. O'Brien School of Math and Science. I work with the Boston Student Advisory Council as well as Youth on Board. I'm writing this testimony to amplify the voices of the young people because I have seen and experienced the repercussions of ineffectual budgeting, specifically in relation to social and emotional supports on students in school environments. At my school, although we are fortunate to have an increase in our budget this year, we still lack the full funding to support a truly wholesome education. Some of the resources we are not equipped with are full and well-stocked library, enough counselors to provide our student population with proper support, and a rich and diverse curriculum that speaks to the interests of students and that provides a wide range of opportunities. These things are basic necessities that every school in our city needs. Young people spend an extensive amount of time in school over the course of the week. Therefore, it is imperative that a school maintain a healthy atmosphere. Much of the youth violence that is seen in and outside of our schools today is caused in part from the lack of support from caring and trusted adults. Many schools employ punitive tactics before any other methods, a process that can lessen the trust between the school administrators, teachers, support staff, and the students, creating unnecessary tension. In order to rid schools of this tension, not only are restorative justice measures necessary, but proper training for staff is also needed. Schools also need assistance and support in developing a culture of trust that will best facilitate these restorative justice practices. I ask that the budget reflect a holistic view of a student. We are not just pupils, but also young people in need of tender care and support to thrive. We need to provide a quality learning environment for all students, yet every year the way we fund our schools creates clear disparities. Last year alone, 49 schools saw large cuts that affected our most vulnerable students. While this year's budget is better because of the weighted student funding formula, the schools that are struggling the most will live in an annual and endless cycle of budget cuts. This is unfair, and we need to think deeply about updating this formula to ensure that no school gets left behind. In order to make sure that every school's needs are fulfilled, we need equitable funding that reflects our commitment to every school. It is important to recognize that Boston is actually a wealthy city, yet part of the reason why our schools struggle in funding every year is that half Half of our land in this city is owned by nonprofits and institutions, which are not required to pay property taxes. Even so, they consistently underpay their voluntary pilot payment, and since 2012, Boston University, Harvard, Northeastern, and Boston College all owe millions of dollars that could be put toward our schools. What these institutions have been asked to contribute is just a small piece of their total wealth, but it could make a huge difference. I ask that our elected leaders demand more from them. Finally, I do want to applaud BPS and the mayor for increasing the overall budget this year, especially more recently listening to parents, teachers, and students and school staff and adding extra funding for nurses, psychologists, and counselors. This is the first step in a series of actions that could elevate our schools and thereby all of the students in BPS. Thank you for taking this time to listen, and I hope that you will consider these thoughts as you make your decisions. And that, again, is Evelyn Reyes, who's a sophomore at the O'Brien. Thank you, and I'll save my questions for the next round.
Oh, go ahead. No one else is here.
No.
Oh,
Is Tim ready to go? Okay.
you're good?
All right. I'll get into my questions. So one of the things that's changed in this year's budget is the way, last year we had this incredible investment to support our students who are experiencing homelessness, and it was its own line item on individual school budgets. This year, as I understand, it's part of the weighted student formula budget, so it hasn't been separated out.
So the change was how the money is distributed. We've included it in weighted student funding, but on school budgets, they still have a line item that is in support of homeless students.
So they can see it out, because when I went through the individual school budgets, there isn't a line like last year. So when I print out, let's look at,
Do you mind holding up the piece of paper you're looking at? That'll help us answer.
yeah, so I'm
it's the
looking at,
allocation
this is the
tracker.
one-pager.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, it's listed on the other,
here,
yeah, we've changed where it is, but it's something we're still working with. So there's there's sort of two different one-pagers.
Okay.
There's the core weighted student funding, one-pager, and then there's the allocation tracker, which shows a school's weighted student funding and then all the supplements to weighted student funding. The homelessness allocation is now a part of weighted student funding, which we think reflects our long-term commitment to that source of funding. So it is available for every school, and it was something that was called out as a part of every school's budget when they received it.
Well, we do know that every school does have at least a student experiencing homelessness. At least it was true last year. I'm assuming it's still.
Yeah, I'd have to double check it,
Okay.
but
So we
I'm
think-
sure it's something close to that.
If it's not all of them, it's almost
It's
all.
very, very, very close if it's not all, yeah.
So my concern is schools during this first year of having this funding have been, thoughtful in their way of using that allocation. But when it becomes part of weighted student formula and in a larger bucket, my concern is that it's going to get used for other purposes.
Yes. I appreciate you bringing up, we hadn't thought of it that way, and that's a good reminder for us to work with the team, the Hearn team, to make sure that it's continues to get the level of attention for the students it was intended to serve. We actually meant it as exactly the opposite, that we thought and that our schools would perceive it being folded into WSF as a signal of its permanence and our commitment to it being becoming a longstanding part of how we fund schools. That was our intention, was as a positive sign of a multi-year commitment, but we'll make sure we work with the team to ensure that it continues to get the attention for the students it was intended for.
Great, because I did receive, and how it was pointed out to me was a school leader reached out and said, we didn't see it in our budget this year. Can you check? I hope it's not somewhere else and
Right.
I've already spent it. So I do think that it's important that we go back and make sure.
We can certainly clarify that.
Please,
Yeah.
please do, thank you. And
And
then,
it was also, can I just say, just
Yeah.
from a timing perspective, last year, we rolled out the homeless allocation later in the process. So mechanically, the school leaders got a loaded line item that said, this is your homeless allocation with it was tagged in a certain way. Because it was new money, we wanted to make sure they saw it. Even if we had kept it as a separate allocation, they would have gotten it loaded at the start of their budget process this year, and it wouldn't have been as obvious. It's just because of the timing thing that they had an explicit thing added to their budget last year.
I just worry that they have spent, some schools maybe have already allocated that for certain resources in their school, which not, that added resource could be a great resource, but if it's not spent for the intention of the funding, and they're still maybe waiting for it to happen the same way it happened last year, that there's going to be some additional surprises coming. And then when we speak with the Hearn office, and when those guys come before us, I'll ask this question, but I want to say it to you guys. Some schools, a number of schools have had some difficulty in spending their money because of the restrictions on how vendors are signed up for the school. And that's, so it's great to give them that money, but then if they can't spend it, or they're forced to spend it in ways that aren't most efficient and beneficial for our kids.
Yeah, and so I was actually on the phone with the school leader last week about spending the money for this year. I think one of the things that the Hearn team has done a really nice job of over the last several months is really working with vendors to identify the types of resources available for school leaders. And so when a school leader called me last week and said, oh my God, the purchasing deadline's approaching, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with the rest of my money to support my homeless students, I was able to connect her to a number of other school leaders that had worked with the Hearn team to identify ways to get school uniforms, food, other clothing, school supplies. And a lot of that is work that the Hearn team has done with vendors. For example, with one of our major school uniform vendors, they were able to get them to agree to provide sort of the raw, branded socks to schools at a lower price as a part of this initiative.
Right.
And we did extend the deadline for schools for the spending of that money specifically, because we want to make sure in this, our first year, we can do this kind of problem solving.
Great, thank you, I appreciate that.
Thank you. We've been joined by City Councilor at Large Mike Flaherty. You want to have no questions? Councilor McCarthy, you want to go back at it?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Go back at it. Thank you. The other question, when we think about school budgets and, the increase in the investment in BPS is fantastic, and we talk about it in big numbers. So there's a reference of a $48 million increase, but I think that includes the additional, and we talked about this the other day, the additional teacher
Supplemental.
salary, that piece there, and we've extracted it, so it's actually a $16 million increase over last year. Is there a way to break it down by, I don't know if I don't necessarily want to, well, I do, but not for our purposes here, but by school budgets. What's the real increase to schools that's not in addition to salary? So we want to, because there isn't, when we're adding additional funds to support our teacher pay, we're not actually adding anything to the school. The teacher is the same. Is the curriculum being enriched? Is any sort of additional activities being added to the school? What is new and additional that's coming to that school, not just the payroll expense?
Yeah, so we can certainly try and
Well,
identify a way to.
Mathematically, I would just say, when it's $40 million total that's going new to school budgets, 30 of it's going to salaries, and 10 is on top of that.
10 is new
The bottom
spending.
line is $10 million of new money on top of salary increases going to school budgets. And then David was going to point us here to slide 8, where we've tried to, we think of it as a summary of school-based decisions. So our job is to equitably and transparently distribute the money where we think it's most needed. And then we work with school leaders who determine their budgets for the year. And then we can look across all of the decisions at 126 schools and see what it adds up to. And that's what's summarized on page 8.
Yeah.
And then my additional questions, because I think it lends itself to that $10 million question, is, again, the loss of some very cherished programming in a lot of our schools, whether it's Playworks or Tenacity or the Boston Debate League. So when we say that schools are receiving additional funding, yet for the experience of that child, they're losing programs that they really enjoy.
Yeah. And I think the Boston Debate League is a great example. I think we were able to engage with our school leaders in some creative problem solving to get to help them through any shifts that their school was experiencing. So, for example, working in collaboration with the Boston Debate League, we were able to greatly reduce the cost to individual schools of participating in the debate league. Whereas at this point, I believe last time I checked, something like 80% of the schools that had Boston Debate League this year already had set plans to participate next year, and the other 20% were still working on it. And the district has made a commitment to provide funding to help make sure that there were still availability for citywide tournaments and other things like that. The other thing is that some of our soft landing money went to schools to support any transition they were having with a group like Playworks or any of the other groups you mentioned. So we've been working one-on-one, and our partnerships team, I think, has done a really nice job working one-on-one with every school community to try and lessen the impact of any shifts as much as possible.
And then the soft landings piece, that is for schools that are basically under-enrolled. They would require, if a school was at full capacity, they wouldn't require a soft landing.
So there's two different things. One is the soft landing, which is for the thing we traditionally call a soft landing is for a school experiencing a negative impact in their budget. The primary reason for that is due to enrollment, but there can be other shifts that lead to that. And so a soft landing essentially is you're experiencing maybe a $100,000 decrease related to enrollment, and you get $20,000 soft landing to help you adjust your budget over time for that. And maybe next year, if it goes up, you don't actually have to ever cut all the way down. The second thing that's more tied directly to persistent under-enrollment is the sustainability allocation for a school where they are under-enrolled to a point where the weighted student funding doesn't support the basic needs of the school. I believe there are 9 of those schools this year. And in those cases, we sit down with the school, we go over it, the school leader makes a request that, weighted student funding can't provide the basic needs of the school. We review, we have a definition of what that looks like, and with the instructional superintendent, and then we provide additional funding. So there's $1 million of funding this year. One of our long-term goals is to get rid of the need for that entirely. And we're down one school.
Who are those 9 schools, or if there are 8 now? Who are those schools, and can we identify the top 1 or 2 reasons why they are under-enrolled?
Yeah, so there are 9 schools. Let me make sure I got that right. Yep, 9 schools. They are the Channing Elementary, the Alighieri Montessori, the Bradley Elementary, the Winship Elementary, the Perry K-8, the Conley Elementary, the Grew Elementary, the Winthrop Elementary, and the Chittick Elementary.
And why? Do we have, I know the Perry, for example, I know one of the challenges at the Perry, because that's where my boys are, is an enrollment problem. And I think that some of that problem has been fixed now with changing how enrollment happens at that school. And that's sort of the what I get so worried about is enrollment decides the success of a school. But enrollment isn't necessarily because families aren't selecting that school, it's because they're not available to be selected. And I know that we make, how many exceptions do we make to the enrollment or the assignment process? There are certain exceptions that we would make so that a school would be available to be seen by more people.
It's not an exception. It's part of the design of the assignment plan that we can designate what's called option schools. Option schools are available to just a broader distribution of students. So what you're mentioning is last year, I believe, the Perry went from being just a standard school on the choice system to an option school, which opened it up for more families to select it from further away. I could get the number of option schools. What we do is we try and look across the system and see where we don't have enough schools to assign kids, and try and select the option schools so that that they can better help us assign and guarantee somebody one of the schools that's on their list. There are times when we run the assignment algorithm and just see that there's actually not enough seats for kids, and we have to kind of work through that. I think there's a couple different things that happen with schools. So on that list of schools are schools that are growing or changing their programming. And sometimes when you're changing or growing a program, as an example, the Allegheny is a new school. It's been around for a few years, but it's growing as a school. We need sustainability allocations as it grows to its full school model. There are schools that have recently experienced turnaround, and as part of the turnaround may have experienced decline in enrollment. And so as they go through their process, I'm thinking of the GRU and the Channing as examples of that in Hyde Park. The Bradley and the Conley are schools where the Conley has a bubble classroom. This was 1 year we needed to add an additional K2 class in Roslindale to be able to accommodate more students. That class has moved up. So 1 year it was first grade, the next year it was second grade. So we call it a bubble. It kind of sticks out from their traditional strand. As they bubble up through the grades, it becomes unsustainable because we lose enrollment or the class size grows. So that's kind of an exception. The Conley is certainly not an under-demanded school. It's certainly full at all of the grades. Once the bubble moves out, we anticipate that problem will go away. So there are different sort of scenarios for each, and what we're trying to do better as part of the Build BPS process is think about how do we match school design to neighborhood needs. And so the Perry is a great example of a school where the challenge is in the upper grades, not in the lower grades. So you see it's got a big wait list in K1, a big wait list in K2, and it's full in the early grades. And then as students exit the system or exit the school and don't get replaced, you see really small 7th and 8th grades that cause financial problems.
Thank you, Chad.
Thank you. And we've since been joined by Councilor Kim Janey. Chair recognizes Councilor Flaherty.
And just staying on that, I think we had recognized that when they took the Murphy School out of the East Zone, when they were doing the rezoning. I think folks thought that the default would be that parents would go to the Perry, when that hadn't been the case. And having been both a Perry and a Murphy parent, and we had chose Murphy over parent, and largely driven, and this is the panacea, and you may want to introduce this to the Perry and or to the 9 schools, is the advanced work program. That's what motivates parents. That's what gets parents and kids excited about being able to compete at that level. So you may want to give some thought to putting an advanced work program into the Perry. That's an attractive lure for parents that are making a consideration. Should we stay in the Boston Public Schools? Should we do parochial? Should we do private? Everything's for the race for the exam schools. Quite frankly, we should be having a discussion about having a 4th and a 5th exam school. Why we haven't had that discussion is mind-boggling. Our exam schools, technically, they're the sort of the jewel of the fleet, if you will, and we should be adding to that. The Arts Academy is as well. The doors of the seats, it's busting at the seams over at the Arts Academy. Maybe trying to talk about creating another type of academy. Maybe it's not the arts. Maybe it's math and science, or maybe it's pick an area. We're in a global economy. And my colleagues hear me say this all the time. We boast of having the best colleges and universities in the world, yet our kids that go to these schools, small number of them actually get into those schools, and a percentage of them, after the first year, they're out because they can't compete. So it's like, so how do we kind of do that? And sort of dovetails into the weighted student funding. I'm assuming that kids that can compete and kids that are bright and don't have sort of the learning challenges and the learning differences, that the student weighted funding, we want to make sure that we're not hurting or holding those kids back or those families back either. So it's in our effort to have sort of this rising tide and to connect with folks that need the additional, I guess, weighted student funding. I'd like to make sure that we have assurances that that's not hurting students that are performing. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, Counselor, we have only added to resources for schools this year. So in WSF, we've taken last year's WSF and made additions to it. The one place where we've made some very careful and thoughtful redistribution was in partnerships. which, as I mentioned on Tuesday, was this legacy pot of money that was held at the central office that specifically funded 13 partners that had had relationships with the city going back many years. So that felt like an area that needed to be modernized, and we've worked with every single one of the partners there to make sure that we can transition those relationships. That's the only place where we've made that kind of change. And so we're confident that we've maintained the resources everywhere else in the system.
Okay. Thoughts to adding advanced work in schools that have struggling with enrollment? Been at this a long time, longest-serving member of the City Council. I've seen a lot of budgets, particularly school budgets. One thing I do know is that schools that are performing well, there's a common denominator to that, and it's a strong parental participation. There's a buzz about that school. There's something new and exciting. Some good stuff is happening in that school. It could be a dynamic and engaging principal. It could be dynamic and engaging teachers. And how can we replicate that success throughout the entire school district? And if you have some schools that are not performing that well or are kind of just ho-humming, chugging along, and it needs an infusion of some energy and some enthusiasm, advanced work program brings that right to the table. It creates that instant buzz and aroma of good things happening, success, things are happening, and I think it's a rising tide, and you may want to consider that. And I also want to hear the administration's and the school department's position on additional exam schools.
So I'll take the AWC one first. We've seen an interesting trend in the data, which is that families are showing us that they are less inclined to have their students move between 3rd and 4th grade for AWC. And so it's creating some interesting pressure on some, but not all of our AWC programs, in that they are having trouble getting full. So Nate and I will be happy to take it back to the team and take a look at it and reflection on the Perry, specifically as you mentioned. But I will share that the data shows those trends, which is creating a challenge for some of the AWC programs. The exam school one is one, I can't pretend to have an answer on that, but again, it's something we can take back to the team for conversation. That's not one that I'm ready with a response on that's at this time.
I mean, whether it's sciences, whether it's robotics, whether it's, I mean, it could be in the languages, but why aren't we creating, a 4th and potentially a 5th exam school in the city? Everything's just sort of the race to Latin Academy, the O'Brien. I think we should be providing, more options for parents to send their children, to keep their children in the Boston Public Schools, particularly if you're looking at the tuitions that are going on in some of the private and parochial schools, but also to keep families in the city because they have a great educational option available to them. And just following up on the theory around the Perry, because the Murphy had an advanced work program strand in it. BPS thought the default was going to be the Perry. The default was actually the Condon. And why? Because the Condon has an advanced work program. So if you're a parent and you want the best possible opportunities for your child to compete in the global economy, to be able to compete, to potentially get into one of the best schools in the country, which is Latin Academy and the O'Brien, to be able to get into one of these finest institutions in the world that calls Boston their home, and whether it's BC or BU or Northeastern, et cetera, that's the route of travel, and it's through the advanced work program, quite frankly, that creates the buzz, that creates the energy, that gets the parents excited, parental participation. They're doing fundraisers, they're engaged, and when you look at the schools that are performing well, that's the key to success, and we should be doing that across the city. And why we're not is frustrating. And again, I'm pushing academic excellence. I want to have a discussion about academic excellence, our children throughout the city getting into these great schools, competing in the global economy. So when these companies like Amazon are looking at Boston, our kids, the kids from the neighborhoods of Boston, are able to compete, participate, and have access in that opportunity.
Noted that. We hear you. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just wanted to piggyback a little on that, but let me first acknowledge we've been joined by City Councilor Lydia Edwards. Earlier, I asked about the high school graduation rate of 50%, and then we're talking about the exam schools. They're obviously included in that that metric of kids that go on from Boston Public High Schools, 50%
Right.
don't finish college. If you take out Boston Latin Academy and the O'Brien from that mix, what do those numbers look like?
That's a good question. We have done a similar analysis when you look at our internal high school data, because you are absolutely right. If you just look at averages, it doesn't tell the story of what's happening in Boston. So you've got to peel it apart. And we're aware that in our high schools, we have concentrated need in a subset of our high schools, and we are really committed to supporting them and making sure that overall our high school system is equitable and supported, because you are right. I don't have the data at my fingertips on the what happens for the students when they leave differentiated, but I want to tell you our team is actively working on the high school strategy overall and doing exactly that kind of parsing apart that you're talking about.
Right, I think it's critical because
Yeah.
I don't think I have to be a research expert to understand that 90 to 100% of the Boston Latin kids are graduating high school, as well as Latin Academy and the O'Brien, and that really indicates a big failure in our high schools, all the other district high schools, which is very troubling. And again, probably cries out for a much bigger, robust investment in vocational at least. I wanted to also piggyback on the Winship because I've seen the Winship, and as the second longest serving counselor, the Winship has actually come a long way. Since we changed the assignment program, it's somewhere in the 90% realm of students from the Allston-Brighton community. I see parental involvement at that school as I've never seen, as I have at the Gardner, for example, two gems, but they seem to always be teetering on the edge of losing funding, losing enrollment, and I just want to put in a word that there's a lot of committed parents. The principal is wonderful. To continue to, look to invest to these schools that kind of teetering on the edge of level 2 and 3 and need that extra attention and love to, kind of get over the hump. And I visit that school often. I'm an alum, so they bring me in all the time. And it's great that there's just great stuff going on. And then one last thing, I know that, AWC has drawn a lot of kids out of the Winship in the past. I don't know what the numbers are today, but, the superintendent is looking to kind of make excellence for all the model, right, which is not necessarily to expand AWC. Am I right in that assumption?
We're still learning what we can learn from Excellence for All. Our hope is that we can take what parents love about AWC and make it true for every 4th, 5th, and 6th grader across BPS.
Right.
That's our hope.
Right, and that means increasing rigor.
Yes.
It means knowing what's going on in each classroom, that each classroom is, functioning. There's not disruptions. There's, kids can actually go in, feel safe, have a great learning environment, and not be distracted by other extraneous, non-education related things.
The Winship, I think, actually provides an interesting example for us and what we're trying to do with Excellence for All. In that, I think something like 19 out of 22 kids in that class qualified for AWC. What that means is there's rigorous and excellent instruction in that school already. And I was talking with a colleague whose daughter attended the Roosevelt, where their 3rd grade class had similar results to something like 19 out of 23 of their 3rd graders had qualified for AWC, and the parents got together and basically realized that there's no reason to leave and go to another school and go to AWC when the school was working for them. We see a lot of our elementary schools, and our elementary schools are really good. We have excellent K1, K2 programs. We have strong academics in elementary schools. We have a lot of schools that we should be proud of. And I think just pointing out the AWC programs or some of our most popular schools is doing a disservice to the great teaching and learning that's happening in schools like the Winship that doesn't have AWC, in the Linden, the BTU school, which I know a lot about.
Right, Mary Lyons.
The Mary Lyon, the Roosevelt. We
Garner.
could go on the number of schools that parents are extremely proud about. And what we're trying to do is remove the idea that by labeling a class advanced, that's the only way that kids can get rigorous instruction. And move to a place where there's an expectation that whether or not your kid qualified by taking an exam, or whether or not your kid just needs to be pushed further or received extra supports, that they're all going to have access to that rigorous curriculum. Because fourth grade's awfully early to start sorting our kids by ability. Sixth grade is really early to be sorting our kids by ability, right? We want all kids to have access to really high level. How many of us struggled in some class between fourth and sixth grade, but then did well in high school or even in college? Kids need the opportunity to advance at different speeds and then have access to that rigor. And I think if we start to put in more mechanisms where we sort our kids and have them change schools and start to say, these kids now have access to that rigor and these kids don't, I think we're going to disservice our students, we're going to disservice our schools. And so, sorry, this turned into a little bit of a soapbox moment on AWC, but that's what we're trying to do with Excellence for All.
Right, I understand, and I think the Winship suffered a little from the aforementioned bubble class that they had too. They lost several students, and I think they haven't been able to fully come back from that. But I see it as a real, gem on the cusp of excellence, and want to just make sure that we keep that train running.
Thank you.
Let me recognize we've been joined by Councilor Ed Flynn again, and let me recognize Councilor Janey.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. I apologize if some of my questions have been asked and answered. I was at an event in my district this morning, so I'm coming late. I did want to commend the chair for making his comments earlier about the need to really focus on the district high schools, and that some of the data that when we look at that data, we're not really getting a true picture of what is happening in our schools if it is weighted by what we're seeing with the exam schools. And into the discussion around AWC, which I think is also important, where you want to ensure that what parents and students love about AWC is true for all fourth graders. I would say the same is true with the exam schools. What parents and what students love about the exam schools, we want to make sure that that is also available to all of our high school students throughout the district. So I appreciate your sentiment in that we don't want to sort and track students, but to ensure that all students in BPS get that rigor and that opportunity to excel. I'm very much interested in earlier budget hearing. And since we're talking about enrollment, the enrollment of Madison came up, and I'm not sure if that came up earlier today, but I'm very much interested. One, again, if you could tell me the trends of what we've seen over the last 3 to 5 years in terms of enrollment, dips going up, going down.
Madison Park's enrollment has shrunk for the last several years. We can pull the specific data for you. Nate was mentioning earlier that we've seen the tail end of a relatively large cohort of high schoolers leave. The other thing that had happened at Madison Park historically is we had looked at the concentration of special education programs at Madison Park and moved some of those programs to other schools, so they did see a slight decrease in their special ed enrollment over the last 3 or 4 years as some of that sort of disproportionate nature was resolved. We are cautiously optimistic that the new leadership team over the last couple of years at Madison Park is starting to reverse the tide of this enrollment. If we look at their 9th and 10th grade relative to their 11th grade, we're seeing some stability in their enrollment and even some signs of possible growth that may be masked. So their enrollment's projected to go down by 30 students from this year to next year, but that's the last really big class leaving from before they went turnaround.
And so what year did Madison shift in terms of not accepting students who did not choose the school? Wasn't there a change in the assignment?
That policy was put in place 2.5 years ago, I believe.
I think it was for the 15-16 school year, or is it for the
I think it would have been for.
That aligns. So
for
the
16-17?
in terms of the overall enrollment in Madison Park, if you look from 2014 was 923, 2015 905, 2016, which is I believe the first year that the policy changed in terms of how we assign students, it went to 854, and then 850 was 852 for 2017, projected for 837 next year. That's just total enrollment. That doesn't give the breakdown by, of course, students in special education program or ELL program. So where you're starting, as David mentioned, you see a big decline in that year, and the larger cohorts are graduating, and they're being replaced by a more steady enrollment that is students who chose the vocational program explicitly.
Right, and so what has the decline, how has that impacted the actual budget for the school and what resources? And if you're seeing less students with disabilities, which would then draw a greater weight in terms of funding, how has that impacted the school budget?
Yeah, so in the current year, the impact is minimal. Their staffing is essentially flat. They've made some adjustments into the types of positions that we would have to get back to you on exactly what they're thinking on that after consulting with the school team. So exactly what types of positions they have has changed a bit, but in terms of the overall budget, I think when you voted it this time last year, there were 155 positions. We're projecting for next year they're going to have 155.5. So, flat with slightly fewer students. What we saw a couple of years ago when I was a part of the turnaround planning process with the school when they were designated was they had to do a relatively significant shift between what types of teachers existed in the school before the current leadership got there and what types of teachers were right for the program moving forward. And so the turnaround planning process was a part of that. So as they were shifting towards having a slightly lower concentration of students with significant disabilities, some of their special education staff transitioned to being either vocational staff or general ed staff or other support staff. They also have been seeing a slight increase in the number of students who are English language learners, so they've added staff as a part of that process for students who are learning English. That mostly happened, though, as they went into turnaround, as we really dug deep with the new leadership team there to think about what is the right type of schedule and supports needed for those students. And that's where the current level of supplemental that the school gets was determined based on a really deep evaluation of that need as a part of the, I believe as a part of the 2017 budget.
Yes.
And you mentioned that the enrollment had decreased over the last several years and that the staffing stayed steady for the last couple. How has staffing then compared to enrollment? Are there fewer staff just over a longer period of time? Or when you say stay steady, is it just the last 2 years? And so are class sizes getting smaller?
I'd have to look at going back more than the current year. I'd have to pull that data back.
When David was saying the 155, I believe it was, he was saying currently at the school in this school year, there are 155 staff. Next year, it's 155.5.
Yeah.
So the staffing has been roughly flat between this year and next year's school year, despite the decline. And, the enrollment decline of roughly 30 students between this year and next year is relatively small for a school the size of Madison Park.
Last thing on Madison, the Opportunity Index, how was that either helping or hurting Madison?
So Madison Park has an Opportunity Index score of 0.698, which ranks it among the needier schools in the district. One of the things that was a little bit different about Madison Park versus other schools is we didn't shift their partnership, so they partner with RoxMap. And so that, they didn't have the opportunity to sort of rethink that because we want to maintain that partnership. The school did get additional resources as a part of our investment in the Opportunity Index, though on top of investment in partnership through RocksMap.
And so you mentioned the needier schools, and earlier someone made a comment about the concentrated need of a subset of schools. If we could just kind of flesh that out and talk about which schools are we seeing? Who are-
Yeah, I don't think it's anything that's going to surprise you. When we look across our high schools, we see that we have more students who are higher need, particularly in our comprehensive high schools and in a school like Madison Park, versus our exam schools or our schools with special admissions. And we look at it in a number of dimensions. We've looked at it through measures of poverty, ELL, special education status, the things that are most reflected in WSF, most heavily weighted in WSF. And then we've also looked at it in terms of their preparation for high school. What was their attendance like in middle school? What were their test scores like in middle school? And it's in that second category of past academic results where you see, I think that the story looks even more pronounced that the need is concentrated. And part of what we are trying to do as a finance team is recognize that we want to make some shifts so that the funding reflects that. And the Opportunity Index is part of that effort. Not to get overly technical, but the index is different for elementary, middle, and high. And in it's based on what the regression said is most correlated with student outcomes. And not surprisingly, by the time you get to high school, what we know happened in middle school is very predictive of what's going to happen in high school. Not entirely, there are kids that beat the odds, but we know more about you than we know about an incoming kindergartner. And so we're using the Opportunity Index to fold that data in. We have an existing weight in WS, we call it our at-risk indicator, but we want to do more to reflect that aspect of need. We think we do a good job already at recognizing and funding need for specific instructional demands from ELL and special education, and we're trying to do more to reflect this need that's represented by what happened in your middle school years.
Could you talk about enrollment overall? So enrollment is increasing?
We've been relatively steady in BPS for the last 5 years. We've hovered around 56,000.
Didn't it go up to 57 at some point, or no?
Our enrollment fluctuates throughout the year and by grade and program. So it depends on what point in time you're talking about. At any given time, we have about 56,000 students. Our projections, our weighted student funding number looks closer to 57,000 because we have to project capacity at each program and grade to the peak point in the year, so we have enough staff prepared. In any given year, we have almost 60,000 students who go through the Boston Public Schools, either coming in late or coming in early and leaving.
Yeah.
So,
And what are we seeing in terms of specific schools? Are we seeing things that look kind of out of sorts based on whether a school became a turnaround school or suddenly got a new program? Are we seeing anything that looks unusual in terms of enrollment throughout our elementary and middle schools in particular?
There are certain, oh, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, I stare at enrollment numbers way too often to feel like anything looks too abnormal. I think we do see effects of schools in turnaround, though not in the first year. It's usually a year or two delayed, and we see some declines. We do have some challenges in our middle grades in particular with the match of capacity and enrollment. We have extra seats in our middle schools. Particularly our standalone middle schools have seen declining enrollment, though we're not projecting a decline for next year because we've stabilized our capacity, but we see that they're under-enrolled relative to their total building size.
Last question. And is the district still doing administrative assignments as a way of keeping certain schools viable?
No.
Underchosen schools viable? So that had been the practice in years past, and I'm just wondering if that's still happening.
So I can't speak about past practice, and I've certainly heard that from a number of people that believed it as one of the things that we do to help support under-enrolled schools. The way that admin assignments typically work is it's the closest school with space to your home. So it looks like schools, some of our schools, particularly in Roxbury, that look like we're propping them up with admin assignment. It's just because they're so close to so many students. I pulled the data the other day just as a point of 10,000 students, K to 12, live within 1 mile of the Frederick. That's a lot of students in one concentrated area. So you do see disproportional admin assignments to certain schools, not because we're trying to prop up enrollment, but because the rule is the closest school with space is where you're admin assigned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Edwards?
I just had some quick questions about within my district, but also to just, I think I talked about the softer landing with declining enrollment. I was specifically talking about East Boston High School. The school committee did produce a budget that had decreased the funding for the high school, and we are struggling, or the school is done an immense amount of work, but it's still at a level 3, and we're trying our best to make sure it doesn't go into a level 4. And so with the decline in budget for a school that's already struggling, I'm just wondering how we can work together to make sure that this one of the schools has the resources it needs to continue to educate the folks in our district.
I think Dave is probably going to talk about the specific changes to the East Boston High. I just want to say, East Boston's another interesting example for us because when I first started in budget 4 or 5 years ago, the conversations we were having about East Boston High was concern over reaching the fire limit in the building at 1,500 students. And East Boston is one of our comprehensive high schools that attracts so many families from the neighborhood.
Right.
And now we're seeing declining enrollment, and we anticipate the declining enrollment continuing through East Boston. And the reason is, again, larger cohorts of students are graduating, so larger classes are graduating and being replaced by smaller classes. And so they're going to experience at least another year, probably 2, of 100 student declines in enrollment, not because of any strong change in opinion of people about the school, but just a shift in the number of students we have in those grade levels district-wide. And so it creates an interesting challenge for us, which is we need to right-size our schools to the number of students they serve. So if you had 20 English classes to serve 1,500 kids, and now you're serving 1,300 kids, you're going to need less English classes. That doesn't mean kids are losing services. It just means you just don't have to make as many classes for them, even though it's the same number. And so we do need to both right-size the school, which will reduce their budget, reduce their staff, but not necessarily reduce the services each individual student receives. And so that's our challenge whenever we're working with any of our high schools who are experiencing those sort of declining numbers. And David, I don't know if there's anything in particular about East Boston you wanted to add in terms of the reductions they've made, or?
Yeah, so East Boston High School, I was just looking through the data on the soft landing. East Boston High School qualified for the second largest soft landing that we gave out this year in terms of support for our high need schools. It essentially amounted to a position and a half added back to the school budget. When I was just looking through my emails with the headmaster, and I believe in the last time we spoke, he was talking about adding a guidance counselor and a 0.5 teaching position back in. I will try and clarify where he ended up.
Where does the high school land on the opportunity index?
Their opportunity index score.
I think they're right around 0.67. No?
I think so.
Doing that from memory, so clearly David's going to get the number.
While he looks that up, I was just going to say, all of the opportunity index scores for individual schools can be found on their, what we refer to as their weighted student funding template. And that's on our budget website, bostonpublicschools.com/budget, for all of you following along at home. And so you can go to the website, download the template, and see the score of the individual schools on there.
I was overconfident in my ability to remember that number. It's 0.58, and they did qualify for both pockets of money that were distributed through the OI this year, which was both the partnership funds and the additional discretionary funds that we call school support.
So with the opportunity index, you're looking at, the needs of the students
Yeah.
and weighted funding. In that package of assessment, do you look at safety in the school?
No. Safety inside the school, no. And the intention for the Opportunity Index was to look at the need that students bring to school every day, the factors that are outside of control of the school. I had school leaders say to me, my kids come with a lot in their backpacks, and it's not all books. They come with needs, and what we were trying to do is gather all of the data available to us in Boston to recognize that and acknowledge it.
I think one of the concerns is that safety has a direct impact on a person's ability to learn and
We
for
totally
teachers'
agree.
abilities to teach. And so with having now 3 incidences
Yes.
in our high school that were safety connected, at the parents' meeting, what came up a lot was what are the resources being provided to the schools and how is that being calculated specifically for East
Yes.
Boston High School?
And those resources and supports would likely just come from other parts of BPS, not the funds we're allocating through the Opportunity Index. So I know that our Office of School Safety is working closely with East Boston. We're trying to make sure they have what they need. It's just a different bucket of resources. The Opportunity Index is more intended to recognize students who are living in neighborhoods where they might be seeing gun violence or seeing other forms of trauma before they arrive at school. So we agree with you completely. We're trying to address both.
So, and also impacting the ability for students to learn is, of course, the class time that teachers have there. And one of the biggest issues we had just discussed yesterday with teachers and with the BTD is the parking issue and the fact that teachers are leaving the classes to move their cars and are getting towed. And so I don't know if there's any plan at all in BPS in your assessment of how to make sure that teachers can actually stay there. And with the increase now in the nurses that you're going to have moving between the schools and them also being ticketed, there's a real concern that what you're increasing in your budget, you're also taking away from people's salaries and their time and from our classrooms.
Yeah, we've tried to, the interesting assessment on Bill BPS was around parking and drop-off for families is another issue at a number of our schools. We've had conversations with the BTD before around parking for teachers. We don't have a comprehensive solution across the city. In some cases, there are schools where we know teachers are going to need to take public transportation. And it's something that we do consider as part of when we start to think about our plans in the future for schools and expansions or acquisition of property to be able to build schools. It's hard to say how much we'll end up prioritizing that given all of the needs and the constraints around space, because oftentimes we think about the trade-off between playgrounds and parking. It is having to drop off 2 kids in 2 different places in the morning. I can tell you it is not an insignificant challenge just doing it for drop-off, let alone thinking about parking for the day.
My final question is about the Edwards Middle School. You had mentioned that standalone middle schools are seeing a decline, and I've heard as high as 80% of the Edwards Middle School are actually kids bussed in from East Boston. And so I'm trying to figure out what makes sense in terms of, or what you're seeing makes sense in terms of the future of the Edwards School and either this movement to push more K-8s and K-6s, and how we're going to deal with the standalone school in our district, and financially, what are you guys seeing as making the most sense?
Yeah, the overlap between the Edwards and East Boston is strong. I think it may be as much as 80%, and I can certainly get those numbers. Any path forward for K-6 or K-8 in East Boston has to take into consideration the Edwards. One of the challenges that we've had in the past is as we expanded K-8s in the district as part of the redesign and reinvest initiative starting in 2010, we didn't take comprehensive middle schools offline at the same rate, and that's caused the decline. So as the K-8s have expanded, we see the decline in the standalone middle schools. So we need to be smarter and more strategic in terms of making sure we manage our capacity in those middle grades. East Boston is unique in terms of the number of students that we have that both take up seats in Boston Public Schools. It's one of our highest neighborhoods in terms of participation, and also the number of students who go to school in their neighborhood. As part of the East Boston guarantee for the student assignment plan, it's something like 70% of the students who attend Boston Public Schools in East Boston from East Boston. That's a huge percentage relative to other neighborhoods. That was a long-winded way of saying that space is at a premium. We have small schools in East Boston. The expansion of K-6 is challenging just because we are literally looking for empty classrooms that don't exist in that part of the city. So I think when we think about Bill BPS and the future plans, I think it's going to require construction in East Boston, which of course is a long timeline. And then, you know, the impacts on Charlestown, and as a result, the Edwards it is an East Boston question primarily.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been joined by Councilor Frank Baker. Chair recognizes Councilor Ed Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Siomo, for your leadership on this issue, and Councilor Asabi George for your leadership as well. I have a few questions. I just want to follow up on Councilor Edwards' question on safety in the schools. What is in the budget proposed that will make our schools safer? I know there's been several incidents in our schools, and there was one in my neighborhood at the Condon as well. I had an opportunity to talk to the superintendent about safety in our schools. What are we specifically allocating our funds for to make our schools safer?
We have a couple of additional investments in school safety, and we will have the team who runs that here for future hearings, so they can talk about it in more detail than I can. We're modernizing all of our radios for our school police, and we're adding 2 more police officers in our operating budget. Our capital budget is going to include even more significant investments. I think it's at about $5 million now in the capital investment of funds that will be dedicated to things like cameras, locks, key access. This is an area, as you can imagine, that's getting a lot of our attention and focus right now, as it has for a number of years. Dr. Chang set up a new Office of School Safety specifically dedicated to these kinds of issues 2 years ago, and Kim Pelletrow, who runs that office, will be here with us at one of our future hearings.
Yeah, I'd be interested, maybe I can ask her down the road, but are there any schools right now that are not in compliance with public safety guidelines, whether it's an evacuation plan or the doors or any structure in the building? Those are some of the issues I'd like to, get some answers on, down the road. If you don't have the answers right now, I can get it from her as well.
I'll defer to Kim on this.
Can I just interject that we will have a hearing specifically for school safety? Yeah. As a matter of fact, I'm going to start distributing each hearing's actual topics. So this hearing today is really for enrollment projections and weighted student funding.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I know in the budget, 92% of students will attend a school with increasing budget. 13 schools will see decreasing budgets. What schools are being decreased?
David will pull that up. Just give us a sec.
And why would you decrease the budget?
All of the schools that fall into that category would be schools that have declining enrollment. So we were just talking, for instance, with Councilor Edwards about East Boston High, where we're just seeing a lot fewer kids who want to attend high school there. There's there are fewer high school kids citywide, and it's specifically hitting East Boston. So as the schools are getting smaller in size, we are adjusting how many classes they offer. I think Nate said a moment ago, we really try to be careful that the schools with declining enrollment, they take offline their unneeded capacity. Like, I don't think any of us want to be funding an English teacher to be standing up there, to have 2 English teachers with 2 half-full classrooms. We want to have, if the school only needs 1, while there are difficult staffing implications for the adults, the right thing to do for the school is to have 1 English class in that situation, not 2. Where we try to tread very carefully is with a school that has declining enrollment, if it starts affecting the services any of the remaining students are receiving, whether it's things like librarian services or athletics or arts and music or counseling. Those are the areas we really try to make sure we're supporting our schools with declining enrollments. And we've put in place a series of supports that were reflected in this year's budget that didn't exist in the past to do just that. I'll defer to David now.
So the 13 schools we're seeing with decreasing budgets for next year are in, I think, alphabetical order, no particular order. The Baldwin, the Chittick, the Grew, the Guild, the Lee Academy, the Winship, Brighton High School, Dorchester Academy, East Boston High School, Greater Eggleston High School, the Haley K-8, the Perry, and Boston Green Academy. For a couple of these schools, this reflects a bubble classroom moving out as part of a restructuring. So for example, the Lee Academy, which has a pathway to young achievers, they have 2 sections per grade up until 2nd grade. This year, they had 3 sections of 2nd grade that are all moving on to young achievers. And so next year, they're going back to having 2 sections per grade across every grade. But losing that 1 section when you only have 10 or 11 classrooms in your school means that your budget goes down. So there's a couple of schools on the list that I mentioned that are in that sort of situation, where it's a structural change that'll have almost no noticeable impact on the school budget.
Now, you mentioned the Perry School. I was talking to a resident of South Boston. He was trying to get his daughter into the Perry kindergarten program unsuccessfully. There were no seats available.
Yeah.
What do we say to that parent that there is no seat for your child at that school, and we're cutting funding for the Perry, and kids are trying to get into the school?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge is the match between the upper grades and the lower grades. If we could add a K-1 classroom at the Perry and have it grow a strand, we might consider doing that. It's a very small building, so we can't expand the capacity in the grades that people are looking. And then in terms of the upper grades, we continue to see the drop-off between 6th and 7th grade at the Perry. Families leaving for exam schools or for other opportunities. And so the 7th and 8th grade are significantly under-enrolled. And so we need to evaluate what is the right grade span for that program, for that school, and what is the right program for that school. Barry has been a multiple-year sustainability school, so part of why you might see a decline is also if there's a change in need for ESL services, or if we don't have to have an ESL instructor for a number of kids, we might remove that from the sustainability allocation.
Well, if one child is getting into the kindergarten program and another child is not getting into the kindergarten program, certainly the child that's in the program is going to be at an advanced level compared to the other child. Let's give these kids an opportunity to get into the kindergarten program so that everyone's equal.
Yeah, in terms of kindergarten, there's K-1 where we're trying to expand the program for 4-year-olds. We're trying to expand and get to a place where we can meet the demand for seats in BPS for our high-quality program. And as I said earlier, we have outstanding early childhood support and programming. I would really put it up against any school district. Having seen it now firsthand with my own son, I can tell you it's outstanding, and we should brag about every school in the system in terms of the K-1 and K-2 programs. So K-1, we're trying to expand. We're just out of space where we can expand K-1. So part of Build BPS's challenge is to find space for that high priority program expansion. K-2 is a guaranteed seat in the city of Boston. Again, something that's unique to some of our suburban neighbors, that it is both universal, full day, and free. And so kids who are not getting into the Perry K-2 program are given access to other schools. And like I said, we do a lot with our early childhood program, and Jason Sachs has been here in the district supporting early childhood for almost a decade, I think, maybe more, to guarantee high-quality programming across all of our schools. And I think, you know, one of the things that we would ask is, as you talk to families and as you start to interact with people who are nervous, right? Because it's very difficult to make educational decisions for your kid. And new parents are often looking for support and guidance about where they can send their kid that is good and will provide a high-quality program. I think by and large you can say that our K-1 and K-2, that families should be knocking down the door for seats in BPS. We just have such great programming there.
Okay. And as it relates to ELL, what are we doing to ensure that, you know, students such as, you know, that speak Cantonese, they're at the Josiah Quincy School, for example, and if there's 0.5 nurses in the building or in the school, how are they interacting with the nurse or with the substitute or with the teacher? Are we ensuring that they have certified translators as well, and the nurses are able to engage with the student?
I don't know enough about how the interpretation services work at a school level. I think we have a presentation from the Office of English Language Learners coming, and they handle all of the interpretation and translation services. So I'll make sure to pass that question along. I will say, and I mentioned this, I think, at the hearing yesterday, that the Office of Human Capital is increasing our recruiting efforts for multilingual staff so that we can start to match support staff, in particular social workers, nurses, school psychologists, with language abilities with the students in the system. And I know that the Quincy is you know, a unique place in that they've really fostered that Chinese culture, language.
Well, they do. But if a child at the Quincy has limited English and is special education, I want to make sure that child has the same access to communicate with the teacher, with the nurse. You know, are we certain that that child is able to communicate, knowing that he or she might not speak English or special education related issues? Are we certain that they're communicating with the staff at Quincy in their language?
We will be sure that our ELL team's ready to answer that when they're here next week. Sorry that we're not the experts on that. Wouldn't want to answer without confidence.
Okay, and I know there was several hundred students from Puerto Rico that came to Boston over the last last 2 years. How has the placement been? What are some of the issues? What are the concerns? And is there anything that we need to do to advocate on their behalf?
So from an enrollment perspective, it certainly has increased the number of students who need Spanish programs, Spanish ELL programs for the district. What we saw is all of our programs were full earlier in the year than we're used to. We were able to accommodate the students without opening new classrooms because we had space and we have the ability to add a paraprofessional and increase the class size. We have done a lot as a district to support their needs outside of the classroom as well. And the superintendent created a group specifically to review the needs of those students. I think it might be best for, in Eleanor's spirit of not being too confident in our own answers, I'll ask the ELL department to talk about the transition and the support for kids coming from Puerto Rico.
And I will just add that the mayor and the superintendent together were deeply committed to making sure we had a very welcoming environment for any student who is joining us from anywhere in the world, but particularly after what happened in Puerto Rico. And so they've both made it a huge priority.
I will also just call out, so there's a specific part of the BPS website, bostonpublicschools.org/BPS Cares, that's in English and Spanish that identifies a lot of resources available for families coming in that from Puerto Rico.
And what is the overall status of South Boston High School? I know many years ago, there was 3 high schools in that building, Monument, Excel, and Odyssey. What is happening at South Boston High School?
Currently, Excel is the only program in the South Boston Education Complex, former South Boston High.
And what is the reason for?
Why is it the only program currently? So the small schools movement was an initiative funded by the Gates Foundation over 10 years ago now, where we broke up our large comprehensive high schools into smaller learning communities. West Roxbury Education Complex was split up into 4 programs, Brook Farm, Path, Urban Science Academy, and the West Roxbury Academy. The Hyde Park Education Complex was broken into 3 programs, Social Justice Academy. I should have started naming them because now I'm not going to be able to come up with them all. Dorchester High School was broken up, and South Boston High School was broken up into these small learning communities. It's a great cost to operate very small high schools and provide the resources, and it didn't turn out to pan out with the academic effects that we anticipated. Also, we saw a pretty significant decline in demand for those schools. And so in 2010, a number of those schools, including Odyssey, Monument High, were some of the schools that were closed. We have not recently closed any of the schools that were part of that small school movement, though we still do see decline in demand for schools like Urban Science and West Roxbury Academy as 2 schools that are co-located. The other thing I'll just note is, generally speaking, we don't think of co-location as a primary goal. We want to have schools in their own building. We've had some challenges with co-locations in the past, and when you're trying to develop your own school culture and manage the behavior and everything that's going on in your building, you don't want to have to compete with another school culture as well. So co-location is not something that we sort of look to do, though we do have space in the South Boston Education Complex that we'll be looking to use in the future.
Thank you. And could I ask one more question? Sure. I know one of my colleagues mentioned it earlier, but as it relates to BPS and the City of Boston Transportation Department, do you think we could consider having a pilot program for teachers that live outside of the neighborhood to possibly give them a parking sticker during school time so that they could park in the neighborhood? Is that something BPS would work with transportation on?
I think so. But John Hanlon in operations would probably be a better person to talk. I know we've reached out to try and identify for specific school communities. I think the barrier is on the transportation side and on the community side. We actually have seen in a couple of our schools and around a couple of our schools, communities get approval for resident parking because the teachers coming in and other things that have happened have caused a demand for parking in the area. So this is an interesting place where we would love to have parking passes, I think, for our teachers and make it easier for them, but I think the neighborhoods would probably push back.
I don't know if that would be true. Like, as an example, at South Boston, a lot of people drive to work, so that there are a lot of spaces during the day, because their cars aren't there. But for a teacher to park there, I don't think that would be an issue, giving them the opportunity to park from 7 in the morning till 3 or 4 in the afternoon. I think a pilot program would work, and I think the neighborhood would support that. They want to see the school be successful.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I think in Brighton we've had.
Happy to move on this topic.
I'd love to follow your charge on that. I think it's going to take some negotiation with the neighborhoods, but I think it'd be a great benefit for our.
Just to let you know what my experience was around the Gardner School. We were lobbied to open it up, and it was somewhat contentious. We came to I think a fair agreement over time, but it wasn't like the residents embracing this idea after they had petitions signed to make it residents only.
Right, okay.
It just my experience, you could have a different experience, but
Yeah, thank you,
it
Counsel.
wasn't a slam dunk.
Yeah, I probably don't have any more time for any more questions. I'll get the next round.
Okay, thanks, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Sabi George?
Thank you. I do have a few more questions. I would say that the greatest concern with the parking issue for staff is the itinerant workers that are moving from school to school. But I'll get back to the subject at hand.
Do we have a
What-
parking topic? No.
We can add it. So when we think about the budgets that each of the schools receive, which positions do school leaders not have any autonomy over funding? What's not sort of flexible spending?
Yeah, so there are varying degrees of autonomy, right? So, for example, if a school is projected to have 40 second graders in general ed, they don't have any autonomy over having at least 2 second grade teachers. Now, I suppose they do technically have the autonomy to add a third if they really wanted. And some of our schools do in different sort of special ed programs or programs for English language learners. Essentially what the limits on autonomy have to do with our collective bargaining agreement, so class size maxima and student-teacher ratios for certain programs, and then any legal agreements or other regulations we have, such as our agreement with the Department of Justice and Meta around our work with English language learners, and our requirements under state law for our work with students with disabilities. Then there are some areas of sort of moderate autonomy. So for example, we have a requirement that you have a certain amount of specialists in an elementary school to ensure that your homeroom teachers are getting appropriate planning time. But the school leader has autonomy over the type of specialist available under some guidelines and requirements. So there's a requirement for a certain amount of physical education, for example, but a school can decide, do they want art, music, theater, dance, STEM, what type of sort of specialist support they want. And then there's sort of the fully discretionary resources that come on top of any specific guidelines we have, where school leaders are making choices between, do they want an operations manager for their school? Do they want a parent coordinator? Are they looking for a partnerships manager if the school has a lot of partnerships, especially some of our high schools have that, et cetera.
And that additional funds for that,
Yeah.
those positions there that you just mentioned, is that what's left over from the weighted student funding allotment after the teachers have been taken care of and the specialists and sort of that list that you initially?
It's primarily through that mechanism. So it's when our schools are full, a portion of what they get under their core weighted student funding goes for those sorts of discretionary resources, but also our higher need schools get weighted student funding allocations that are purely designed for those types of discretionary supports. So there is no, for example, this new $3 million we put in for under the Opportunity Index, there is no requirement on that. That is just goes straight into that last bucket of discretionary resources.
Great. So, I know the topic today has been, or this morning has been the weighted student formula and how it's really related to enrollment projections. So when a school is under-enrolled, even by a few kids in every classroom, that can be devastating for a school community. And then we talk about soft landings and the sustainability allocation and all that. And I think that inclusion, although we'll talk about inclusion as a practice in a later hearing, as we move to a district that is almost all inclusion across all grades, we see that we're not able to fill those seats. So there are many classrooms across the district that have empty inclusion seats. Do you have an idea of what that number is and what sort of impact that has on an individual school's budget?
I don't have the number of sort of partially filled inclusion classes, though I think we could probably pull the data for K to 8.
Is that a real problem, though? Is that, I've heard a little bit of that in some of my school visits and conversations. Is that a real concern?
It is a real concern. I think when We have a little bit of the chicken and egg challenge with when it comes to expansion of new programs and getting to a place where we can be more inclusive, which is we need to build the capacity for students before they are identified as needing an inclusion setting, because it is driven by the student's individual education plan. We can't just move students. And so we also have a very set capacity number for our inclusion program, which is it's in K to 8, it's a 15 and 5, meaning there are 15 general education students and 5 students who have been identified as needing an inclusion setting, a special
But
education.
we have classrooms that have a wait list for general ed.
Yep.
For one of those 15 seats, but we're not at full capacity with the 5 inclusion. Is there ever an opportunity throughout the school year, perhaps before the wait list closes, to fill those 5, any of those open, say, 5 inclusion seats with a general ed kid?
Yeah, and there's a couple different ways that situation arises. I will say that some of the times that you see an empty inclusion seat, which is and if you actually walked in the classroom, we hold the capacity or pay for the capacity up front so that we have the seat available when the student gets identified in, say, December or January. And so the school was funded for an enrollment that will be coming at a later point. So we wouldn't assign a kid in October to a general education student to that seat because we need to keep the capacity open. And we try and manage the capacity across the district so that we have the right number in the right place. Though with the broad expansion of enrollment and as it's rolled up through the grades, we probably expanded more inclusion classrooms than we needed to in order to accommodate the demand for those inclusion seats.
Yeah, and I think as a policy, it's a lovely idea to have inclusion across all grades and all schools, but if the demand's not there and it in turn ends up hurting schools from a budget perspective, but then also can negatively impact the classroom experience for our students because the classrooms aren't being appropriately supported by the right number of adults or the right number of properly supported adults in that classroom. That creates some other challenges, so it's not a fulfilling experience for anybody. So I would be curious in the number of inclusion seats across the district that are unfilled, and then to bring it one step further, the inclusion seats that are unfilled in classrooms that have wait lists. And I get holding a seat sometimes at those earlier grades, but when we're now expanding it across all grades, there's a lot of empty seats that can be, if a 4th grade seat isn't filled, an inclusion seat, or a 5th grade or a 3rd grade, are you telling me that the district is funding that school as if that seat is full?
So what we work on as a part of the enrollment projections and budgeting process in collaboration with the special education department are situations where we only are projecting the students if we're expecting them to come, right? So in a case where we're holding a seat open and denying students in general education access to that seat, it's because we expect or projecting students to come. So we've been working with schools that have seen, especially as it rolls to upper grades, emptier seats to say, okay, with the special education department looking at demand across the whole district, maybe this school will go to 16 and 4 instead of 15 and 5, right? Open up one more general education seat.
So you are proactively doing that?
We are proactively doing that
that's
with a
great.
number of schools. Yeah, and it's really based on special education is looking at what is our demand across the district and by neighborhood, making sure that we have enough seats that we've opened and are guaranteeing. And the other thing is we've done review of programs. So we have one school in particular that does not have an inclusion program at all grades. They only had one in K0 and K1. So just one class of inclusion in the school. And that class was a legacy from a long time ago where there weren't a lot of options. Now that neighborhood has a lot of K0, K1 options, and we were seeing that classroom under-enrolled. So for next year, we stopped assigning kids to that class. We moved and then transitioned that class from being inclusion to being a general ed class. So now that class is going to go from having a class size of 15 in K0, K1 to 22, and all the seats are going to be open for general ed, knowing that that neighborhood, as we looked across the neighborhood, as a part of the inclusion and expansion, has enough seats for the students with disabilities, right? And so we actually then closed the inclusion class at that school and opened it as a general education class instead.
And is it full?
I think we're still
Will
going
it
through
be
the rounds.
full?
I don't
Yeah.
know if it's.
No, I
hope so.
think it's great, and it's encouraging to know that you're being that flexible with those numbers and recognize it as a challenge. I wish in our schools that are K-8 that have dramatically underfilled 7th and 8th grades, for example, that we were that sort of flexible and quick with making adjustments. My boys have been at the Perry for so many years. 7th and 8th grade, they're less than half full classes. And, you know, we've talked as a school community for too many years about moving it to a K-6. There's a demand at the lower grades. There's a tremendous wait list. You know, let's just get there already, which is a real challenge, because then it in turn affects the school's budget and those additional discretionary dollars that support, again, the Playworks, the Boston Debate League, tenacity programs like we heard the other day. Today I got a phone call about the TAG and the Alerta programs. You know, so it has these other impacts on programs that make schools very attractive to families and, you know, to do right by our kids.
Counselor, do you mind if I make one more comment?
Sure.
We heard a lot about this last year from you, from others in the community, concern about how we funded schools. I just want to be emphatic that we did things differently this year. We didn't throw out the whole system and try to reinvent it, but we heard you loud and clear last year that we had had too much instability for our schools, and we made some adjustments for this year's this school year's budget, but when we got the budget in place, we immediately turned to planning for FY19. We pulled together this budget equity work group that met monthly for 6 to 9 months and worked with the OAG task force. We went around and visited schools and talked to principals about what they thought. We talked to leaders in other districts that have versions of WSF, and the summary of the changes that are on this page, I just want to emphasize, we really feel like we entered this year trying to make some significant changes to how we fund schools. I don't know that we've gotten it perfect yet, but I will say that anecdotally, when David and Nate and I were walking through the hallways at Bowling this year, when we do these things called budget collaboratives where every school comes in to figure out their budget, the difference was palpable. Did I get that word right? Palatable? Palatable. You could feel the difference. You know, school leaders, for the first time, some of our school leaders who are serving some of our highest need kids, I actually have a video of one of them singing and dancing because she was making investments for the first time.
You promised not to show that to anyone.
Yeah, I did. And there are still instances where we're not where we want to be. I'm not trying to claim that it's perfect, but we really tried to make changes versus last year. And I think, I can't point to data that say this percentage of principals are happy this year versus last year, but I really think we moved the needle on
I think that would be good data to collect.
Yeah, maybe we should do a survey. It felt really different in those couple weeks, and there are places where we need to do work still, but I want to just thank you for how you pushed us last year in the budget process, because it was a big part of what led to the changes in this year's budget.
Thank you. On that note.
Good. That's a great note to end. Thanks again for your time and testimony. This hearing is adjourned.